A Western anthropologist watches a shaman working with spirits. The tribe sees the spirits but the anthropologist does not. What next? Bruce Charlton. A spirit, naturally seen by the shaman, invisible to Westerners. Consider, as a thought experiment, a situation that happened for many Western anthropologists who were observing native tribes in various parts of the world. A tribal shaman / medicine man / spirit healer would perform some kind of ceremony, perhaps of healing, in front of the tribe, and everybody present would see spirits, or claim to see spirits, except the anthropologist. What does this mean, that everybody present perceives something, except for one person, who is looking, but does not see? 1 possibility is that the majority are correct, and the minority of one who cannot see spirits has something wrong with him, some kind of perceptual deficit. Since spirit blindness is so common in the West, it is presumably some combination of racial and cultural sensory defect. The answer would seem to be for Westerners to become able to perceive spirits, and if this is taken seriously it leads Westerners towards exploring manipulations of consciousness such as happen during hypnosis and trances, perhaps assisted by music and dance, dreaming sleep, between sleep and waking, or in psychosis, delirium, and from the effects of some kinds of psychoactive drugs. 2. Another possibility is that the majority, the tribesmen, are deluded by their expectations, or perhaps have been duped by a conjuring trick of the shaman. The idea is that the tribesmen are like young children in the West, who are fooled partly because they want to be fooled, and partly because they lack sufficient knowledge and experience. In other words, the testimony of the tribe is irrelevant, the Western anthropologist is right, and everybody else present is wrong. The answer implied is that the tribesmen need to be westernized, and educated in science, so that they will stop seeing what is not really there. 3. For some traditional Orthodox Christians, the spirits seen by the tribesmen are really spirits, and are really there, but are of demonic origin, designed to mislead, corrupt, and spiritually harm the tribesmen. They are seen by the tribe because the tribes are enthralled to the devil worshippers. The Westerners are immune to this demonic deception, either for the positive reason that they are Christians and reject demonic visions, or the negative reason that Western anthropologists usually do not believe in the reality of the devil or of spirits, or indeed of God and angels, and made themselves incapable of perceiving either. So, in the imaginary tribal situation, the demonic influence on the Western atheist is present, but unseen and unconscious. Because the spirits perceived are real but of evil intent, 2. The answer to the problem of tribesmen seeing spirits is to convert them to Christianity, and train them to discern demonic deceptions, so that the tribesmen will cease to see the spirits conjured by shamans. And the same applies to an atheistic anthropologist. 4. A less common interpretation is found among those influenced by Jung, which is that the spirits are real but in an intermediate and imaginal realm, situated between, and bridging between, objective public physical reality and subjective personal reality. This tries to posit a psychological objectivity, distinct from literal physical objectivity. And that this psychological realm is unconsciously collective, shared among all humans, whether they are aware of this or not. So the spirits are symbols, archetypes, of the collective unconscious, being reacted to differently by tribesmen, and the Westerners, due to cultural differences in attitude. The Jungian answer to the different experiences of tribesmen, and Westerners, is that the Westerners need to learn of the reality of the archetypal realm of the collective unconscious, reconnect with it and become conscious of it, and develop a relationship with the objective but symbolic images that inhabit that realm. Thus may Western alienation of men from themselves and the world be alleviated. 5. A perspective derived from Rudolf Steiner and Owen Barfield, which I also believe is correct, is that the spirits are really there, they are not symbols but actual beings, but whether spirits are seen is a matter of the development of consciousness. Some adult tribal people, like some Western children, are less developed in this respect, and still have the ability to perceive spirits. Indeed, they cannot help but perceive spirits, just as Westerners cannot help but perceive physical objects such as trees, chairs and other people. In the West, most adolescent and adult people have lost the spontaneous ability to perceive spirits, and this has also, like the Western anthropologists, made Westerners largely resistant to the communications of spirits. Negatively, the Westerners have lost the ability to see what is there. Positively, Westerners have gained independence from, freedom from, the previously inescapable influence of spirits, which include both good, angelic, and evil, demonic, spirits, as well as other spirits perhaps more neutral, elementals, fairies, or nature spirits. This development of consciousness is divinely driven, and understood to be part of God's plan for the world. So the development of consciousness through an individual person's life, or throughout the history of mankind, is something that happens by means of the incarnation of various kinds of spirits as mortal men, and the attributes and needs of individual premortal spirits. The answer from this Steiner/Barfield perspective is not to ignore spirits, nor to try and perceive them again, nor to relate to spirits via symbolic intermediary symbols or archetypes, but instead to move forward a new relationship with spirits that is rooted in direct knowing of spirits. Instead of the spirit being spontaneously seen and communicating with the man by means of perceived stimuli such as visions, speech or symbolism, the idea is that the spirit is known by the man, in thinking. So, to return to our thought experiment, the tribesmen would see the spirits, because they could not help perceiving spirits. But the observing Steiner-Barfield anthropologist would not see the spirits, because he would instead know by experienced thinking, that the spirits were indeed present and active here and now. This knowing would not be by any intermediary such as picture, sound or symbol, but the knowing would instead be direct knowledge, as intuition, as an experience of knowing occurring in the ongoing stream of thinking. The conflation of Christianity and Church, once inevitable, now impossible. Bruce Charlton. By my understanding, it was once, almost, inevitable that Christianity would be conflated with Church, although exactly which Church, was very soon a matter of deadly dispute. Whether or not such conflation of Christianity and Church was once inevitable, so that it was natural, spontaneous, and necessary for a self-identified Christian to conceptualize his religion in Church terms, this conflation is now contingent upon personal choice. Indeed, the situation is almost reversed, in that it is now natural and spontaneous, and almost unavoidable, for each Christian to conceptualize his own Christianity separately from Church. The tendency to mental separation between Christianity and Church happens in the modern Christian's own mind, even when that Christian asserts and believes in one of the orthodox traditional, Church-defined conceptualizations of being a Christian. The inner mental separation of Christianity from Church probably explains the progressively increasing over the decades, shrill aggression of Church-first Christians in their advocacy and apologetics. In other words, in arguing for an external and groupish conceptualization of Christianity as necessarily church-originating and sustained, they are arguing, primarily, with themselves. In other words, the trad orthodox advocates are fighting their own recurrent inner tendency to separate their church from Christianity, a tendency that is forced upon them by the continual crises and conflicts and profound schisms, endemic within all the Christian churches, as of 2025. I believe that human consciousness, human thinking, has changed over the centuries, and what was once natural, universal, and almost irresistible, has become a forced choice, and almost impossible. The replacement of disinterested judgment by the rule of the uninterested. Bruce Charlton. It has been interesting to observe how the word disinterested, which means impartial, has become co-opted as a synonym of uninterested, which means not having one's mind, feelings or motivation engaged by a thing. Properly speaking, a good judge in a court of law ought to be disinterested, but not uninterested. That is, a good judge ought to be impartial about the guilt of the accused, and guided by the legal process, and its evidences. But the judge needs to be interested in the sense of engaged with the case, paying attention, and giving it active thought. Such a slovenly destruction of meaning as has happened to disinterested, is typical of a society in which people are uninterested, on a massive scale, from top to bottom of social institutions and discussion. Our society is one in which an immense and increasing amount of data is hosed upon people 24/7, most of which is untruthful, lies, distortions, manipulation, and concerning matters about which hardly anybody has any interest, but for which there is a demand that everyone forms a judgment, and is ready to express and defend it. Such everyday judgment is profoundly uninterested, as is necessarily so with such large amounts of stuff. And by the fact that nobody lifts a finger to verify the validity of what is discussed, neither by application of common sense nor personal experience, not by reasoning, not by seeking out further and better information. On top of this, there has been the totalitarian takeover of all major functional social institutions under a single multinational bureaucracy media complex. Such that nowadays no sensible person would expect a judge to be disinterested, because any personal motivation a judge may have with respect to the law, which concept he probably would not recognize as autonomously valid, will be subordinated to pursuit of the establishment agenda. Yet an ideal and good judge would be disinterested about a case, while being intensely interested in the case, exactly because he was strongly motivated by the desire that justice be done in accordance with the spirit and letter of the law. Likewise in what used to be science and the arts. Science used to be, when it really was science, disinterestedly evaluated by a small group of individual scientists, each of whom was truthful and whose main interest was the same species of scientific truth. The disinterestedness of scientific evaluation was therefore a product of intense interest in truth. Now that science is a mass bureaucracy manned by officials and functionaries who are uninterested by the truths they pretend to pursue, the guiding evaluations are provided top-down, by those who manage the system in accordance with ideologies provided by a totalitarian leadership class, in accordance with priorities that have nothing to do with real truth, but only with manipulation. Scientists no longer run professional science, and it has been decades since they did. Consequently, science has nothing to do with truth. And, since truth-seeking/speaking scientists are grit in the machine, over the decades, scientists have been eliminated from the system, except sometimes, as isolated individuals, at a low and system-powerless level. When the arts were good, artistic evaluations, e.g. of music, poetry, fine arts, were dominated by those few individuals who were intensely interested by the species of aesthetic beauty that the particular art provided. Therefore, the arts could be disinterested in their evaluations of quality, exactly because there were powerful and personal artistic interests driving them. Now that the arts are incorporated in the state systems of bureaucracy and the corporate worlds of trading, I mean especially the visual fine arts, painting, sculpture and the like, where nobody involved is genuinely interested in and motivated by aesthetic beauty. Disinterestedness does not happen in the fine arts now. The evaluations of fine arts are based on interest, and the strongest interest now is a not artistic mixture of finance, ideology, careerism, and the usual human corruptions, for example sexual. Artistic evaluations are nowadays utterly worthless with respect to aesthetic beauty, whether these evaluations come from so-called artists, academics, critics, galleries, auctioneers, investors, or whoever. In sum, uninterest in art among those who evaluate art systemically has led to the loss of disinterested evaluation throughout the institutions of the arts. It also leads to the astonishing degree of aesthetic incompetence among those who evaluate the fine arts, which is evident in all areas: awards and prizes, prices in sales, content of exhibitions, and the high prevalence of forgeries and fakes. Competence requires motivation, and therefore is also a product of genuine interest. In sum, genuine interest enables disinterestedness, while lack of interest is the same thing as uninterested. In the world of the uninterested, disinterestedness is impossible and becomes extinct. So, mass linguistic absorption of the word disinterested into meaning simply lack of interest in, has paralleled the disappearance of interested impartiality from public discourse. Why? Because motivations are what determine systems, and motivations derive from our worldview. From our beliefs about the basic structure and purpose of reality. When it has been generally decided that reality has no purpose, and when that truth has sunk in fully and everywhere, which took a few generations, then deep and powerful motivations become impossible, and we get the present world where people function in terms of superficial, labile and short-term motivations, which are easily manipulated top-down. Which is why disinterestedness has been, deliberately, driven to extinction. It has now reached the point where many people cannot even conceive of the world that actually existed 50+ years ago, and more so in the more remote past, and to deny that it ever existed or was possible. It seems impossible, because it was a world where it was normal for many people to be so interested by something that they could, sometimes, be disinterested about it. A good way forward can only come from revealing and challenging those fundamental, metaphysical, assumptions about the nature of reality that have so annihilated deep motivation as to render it unimaginable. One God or many? Bruce Charlton. We posit one God because we need to explain the cohesion of reality, why things hang together and don't fly apart, why there are values, why there is a structure, coordination, predictability, etc. We posit many gods because we need to explain free will/agency, evil, love, creativity, the possibility of change and newness. The main religions and philosophies do a very bad job of covering both these requirements, of explaining how we can actually have all the above. Although, given that historically it is believed that polytheism/many gods is spontaneous and natural and came before monotheism/one God, it could plausibly be argued that there is an innate tendency of those who posit many gods to unite them under a dominating leader, henotheism, thereby providing some of the unifying and cohering attributes of one God. While, in practice if not theory, monotheistic religions exhibit a spontaneous tendency to divide their reverence and supplications among many beings, that are accorded co-deity/semi-deity nature, such as the Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, or the Blessed Virgin Mary, and or specially significant influence on life and creation, such as spirits, saints, holy persons. Thereby answering some of the questions for which polytheism provides answers. Either they pick one, or many, God/s and ignore the need for the other. Or else they explain how things work with language of such abstraction and complexity that it does not count as an explanation. Or they try to stun and deter people from questioning by spouting mystical paradoxes. The result? Look around. Nihilism? People have no coherent and comprehensible explanation for why and how things are, so they have just given up on understanding, and instead focus on getting through each hour/day/year, with the maximum of pleasant and minimum of unpleasant experiences. So, if you want to do better, you won't get off the peg. Help from religions or culture, nobody that you would trust can tell you a valid answer. You will have to do it for yourself. Hawkbit update. Bruce Charlton. For all you Hawkbit fans, I have an important update. I took a slight diversion to walk through the 30 to 40 acre urban field, little more, that forms the densest Hawkbit concentration hereabouts, when I discovered that most of the bright yellow flowers I reported just a fortnight ago, have turned into mini dandelion clock-style seed heads, each a little less than half the diameter of a dandelion clock. So, it turns out that not just the flower but the seed heads resemble their cousins who were thriving about 3 months ago. It is the smaller size and solid, rather than hollow and white sappy, stalk of the Hawkbit that seems to provide the simplest differentiation. Why leftism is wrong in one sentence. William Wildblood. Leftism collapses the vertical to the horizontal. That's it. That is its great error, or sin as you might well call it, since it deforms reality. This is why it can only really infect human consciousness in a time of materialism, and why when it contaminates spirituality, you get a false spirituality that reduces the transcendent to the immanent. It is why it favors egalitarianism over hierarchy and the female over the male being associated with the transcendent. This world must be seen in the light of it being the outermost part of a far greater reality, or else as the furthest removed from the center. When seen as real in its own light, as it is now, it becomes very hard for anyone sensitive to truth to function in it properly. Its values are false, its priorities absurd. Such an attitude strips meaning from life and real purpose from human endeavor. To renounce the world in such circumstances is only right, for what you are renouncing is not the world as God's creation but the world as its own be-all and end-all, with material ends and goals supreme. The material has no meaning apart from the spiritual, but this is the crazy situation in which we find ourselves in the 21st century. All human societies and cultures are focused exclusively in the material, and practically all religions and spiritual approaches, where they do exist, function in that paradigm and defer to it. It is the master, and they must obey their master if they wish to be allowed to exist. It is coming to the point at which a serious person must reject everything in the world. Not just the obvious evil but the public attempts to contest or resist that evil. These are not as bad as the evil itself, but they are the products of it in that they arise in response to it. Hence, they still bear its mark. The only true good can have nothing to do with any of this, as it must exist absolutely independently. The world has now separated itself from the divine. To encounter the divine in anything like a pure form, you must separate yourself from the world. You don't have to run off to the desert or remote northern islands, the world is in those places nowadays anyway, but you must separate yourself psychologically, spiritually even, from the world. It is a fact that no church or spiritual group can help you now. You are on your own or with a few like-minded companions. But that is the point of living at this time. You are being tested in the fire for your spiritual integrity. So many people use the spiritual to further themselves. They are not bad people so much as people who wish to have a foot in both camps. They see the reality of the spiritual, but they only see partially, and they still see through worldly eyes. You must train yourself to see with the spiritual eye, the eye of the heart. Only then will you see truly. Christianity, with its democratization of spirit, has given a false idea of the spiritual path due to its idea that all you need to be saved is to believe. I realize this is a simplification of what Christianity really says, but it is a common idea both outside and within the religion. It fits in very well with the modern ethos that we are all equal, an ethos, by the way, that is only encouraged by the elite to keep the masses subjugated and pull back all those who might seek to separate themselves, spiritually, from the mass. It may be true that all you need to do to be saved is to believe, but the how, why and what of that are essential. It is not mere human belief, but belief that comes from the whole person and consequently transforms being. And then it requires belief in the real as perceived by the inner eye, not some man-made spiritual idol of which there are many, including many in the Christian faith. Ultimately, Only those willing to walk into the fire will be saved. Today those truly on the path are called to a kind of inner martyrdom, but to be so called is a gift, so if you are one of those in that position, be grateful, though know it will involve suffering, for that is what purges the soul and renders it a fit habitat for God into which he may enter. Froth on the surface of life, our civilization's paralysis by metaphysical dissonance. Bruce Charlton. Metaphysical dissonance is what we experience when our superficial and everyday motivations are contradicted by our metaphysical convictions. In other words, when our everyday, on the surface specific attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors are contradicted by our basic understanding of the nature of reality. Metaphysical dissonance is the normal and almost universal state of nearly everybody in the West today, including the religious, including the Christian. It is maybe the single deepest cause of our civilizational paralysis, of our mass demotivation, hence mass cowardice. Metaphysical dissonance explains our chronic inability to do anything positive and helpful about the many potentially lethal attitudes and behaviors that beset us. Our primary motivation in life comes from our metaphysical convictions, and ultimately everything else is merely froth on the surface. Therefore, when metaphysical convictions fail to provide a primary motivation, then we are left with nothing but froth on the surface. Our behavior becomes merely a froth blown about by the winds of culture and society. We have become the most easily manipulated society in history, because our everyday attitudes, thoughts, actions are severed from fundamental roots. Indeed, it is the officially endorsed and taught conviction that there are no fundamental roots. It is officially articulated that the ultimate reality began as a dead universe of physical matter, to which life and consciousness were later added by abstract processes, forces, laws. The ultimate reality is that we and everything else is made of dead stuff. The past just happened to happen the way it did by the operation of causes and chance, and there is no underlying direction, no deep purpose, no meaning, to things in general. And this metaphysics is a matter of conviction. It is not treated as a theory or an assumption, but as a fact, and as such it is the underlying structure of human existence, whatever religion is put on top of it. In effect, religion is just aspect of the froth on the surface of life. Our cultural paralysis is a consequence of metaphysical dissonance, because our underlying metaphysical convictions can have no relation to our surface beliefs about values, ethics, virtue, truth, beauty. The passions and despairs of everyday life amount just to froth, because they are unrooted, unintegrated, and motivate only feebly and briefly. The oceanic tide of existence is towards dissolution of meaning, paralysis of thought and action. And the passivity of despair is alleviated by sporadic frenzies of hedonism, self-gratification, and self-assertion. All this derives from the self-contradictions inherent in trying to build a purposive, meaningful, motivated life, upon foundations that deny the reality of such a life. Because the consequences of dissonance are so bad, and seem in practice unavoidable, there is therefore, I believe, an absolute necessity for each of us to strive to attain metaphysical coherence. In other words, we need to build our surface attitudes, thoughts, behaviors upon foundations that are coherent with them. The foundations and the superstructure need to be mutually consistent. Instead of, as at present, being at war, our convictions need to be mutually supportive. For metaphysical coherence to be possible and effective in supporting our everyday discernments and aspirations, requires that we personally are able to perform this integration between depth and surface. This means that our metaphysical convictions must be 1. Genuinely understood. Metaphysical beliefs cannot be second-hand, or mystical, nor can they be forms of words, nor taken on trust from external authority, all of which have proved demonstrably useless in the past several generations. We each must personally understand, fully grasp the meaning of, our fundamental convictions, in order that we can work with them. 2. Regarded as really real. Our metaphysical convictions need to be such that we regard them as reality, else they will lack power to shape and motivate our lives. We see this at present in that people regard the physics description of things as deep reality, and we observe that the nihilism, purposelessness, meaninglessness, indifference to the individual person, of such conviction subverts, weakens, and negates any amount of religious beliefs. 3. Genuinely endorsed. So far it seems we must genuinely understand our metaphysical beliefs, and need to regard them as descriptive of reality, and on top of these we must endorse them, we need to desire that they be fulfilled. The basis for metaphysical coherence is therefore to insist upon a full understanding and grasp of fundamental assumptions that we personally regard as real and desirable. It may sound as if this is impossible, but we were all incarnated and born with innate but unconscious metaphysical assumptions concerning life. I personally believe that these innate assumptions are God-given, because needed for anyone to live life as God intends. Therefore, the process of achieving metaphysical coherence is mostly a matter of becoming conscious of, evaluating, and then choosing to endorse, that which already exists within each person. Although, in practice, such recovery may need to be achieved by conscious intellectual effort, by searching, analysis, learning from experiences etc., in other words a spiritual quest, whose results need to be checked and confirmed by intuition, meditation, prayer and the like. Asking AI about God has to be the mother of all litmus tests. Francis Berger. Any motivation to interact with the system's newest and latest, top-down endorsed and implemented, reinforced, technological innovation that will change everything so you had better get with the program or get left behind is inherently misguided on its own. However, the specific motivation to engage with AI on the topic of God is so severely perverted, as in turned completely the wrong way, that it utterly transcends the usual exhibitions of spiritual and religious retardation most so-called Christian blogs tend to exhibit. If asking AI about God isn't the mother of all litmus tests, then I don't know what is. Seriously? We live in a time and a place in which any meaningful answers about God must be discovered and worked out internally, within one's being and spirit. We will not find the answers we need exclusively in externals, no, not even in the Bible, tradition, some holy philosopher, or some sacred ritual, doctrine, or service. Christianity needs to get out of its X-Files mode. Spiritual and religious truth is not out there, and it is certainly not in the much praised and vaunted trillion-dollar spiritual black hole the system calls AA. It pains me to say it, but if you don't get that, you're probably beyond all hope. For the love of God, don't ask AI about God. Truth about God somewhere is else entirely. Think about it. Just think about it. Really, really think about it. AI, so-called, and the wisdom of crowds delusion, what is the motivation? Bruce Charlton. Back in the middle noughties I was a new agey atheist, keen on modernity, globalization, economic growth, democracy, a sort of libertarian, and saw many applications of evolutionary theory to human life. That kind of person. See, for instance, this, written at the time, which tried to provide a coherent underlying mechanism for the wisdom of crowds phenomena, derived from complex systems theory. And I was much taken by the general idea of the wisdom of crowds that was prevalent at the time and much discussed, and advocated, on the blogosphere. This argued, and purported to prove inductively, by empirical examples, the generalizable principle that there was a collective wisdom that transcended the individual's knowledge, ability, and judgment. To a considerable extent, the wisdom of crowds theory was merely making explicit our civilization's existing and pervasive implicit faith in the authority of groups, committees, voting, mass opinion. What I then had was a progressivist expectation that things are self-correcting over time, and will spontaneously tend to sort themselves out, if left to themselves, and not interfered with by individual humans or interest groups. An expectation that human affairs are actually much better than commonly acknowledged, and are naturally and impersonally trended on an upward and positive trajectory, over a sufficiently long span. In contrast, was the correct recognition that individual humans would often be dominated by short-termism and selfishness, were lazy, could easily be misled, and in general nearly always were misguided in their aims and actions. Where I strayed from reality was in sharing the common, hopeful, delusional inference that, because individuals were imperfect therefore, the mass of people, the system of people and technologies was preferable, because the mass had an organic tendency towards self-optimization, self-preservation and improvement. In sum, I believed, and wanted it to be true, that crowds reliably exhibited an innate wisdom and virtue which was absent from individuals. Such wishful magical views are actually much more prevalent and dominant than most people would admit, indeed, however vehemently denied when made explicit, such assumptions are almost universal. For instance, almost everybody implicitly believes, and acts on this belief, that a committee, a vote, is more authoritative than an individual human, that elections are the only morally valid way of choosing a government, that consensus is superior to personal judgment, that proper processes and procedures are the best way of conducting important functions, such as government, the law, medicine, science, mass media, and so forth. In sum, there is in Western civilization an extremely strong and widespread aversion to and prejudice against individual persons, and instead a solid faith in the groupish, systemic, and abstract. What this amounts to is a metaphysical assumption concerning the nature of reality. People have a solid faith in and commitment to the group, no matter how vaguely that group is defined, and to some kind of process, as intrinsically superior to any and all individuals. I say people and I mean nearly everybody, if you dig down and are honest about what you find. In ancient societies this belief was unconscious and immersive, in modern societies it is conscious, but mediated by, embedded in, ideologies and religions. The problem is that we are, each and individually, trapped and disempowered by such assumptions, and at the level of thinking. E.e. Before any question of action can arise we are already blocked by our thinking. We feel, deeply, that we personally cannot and should not think anything, unless and until the after-relevant group has endorsed it. But in a totalitarian world inhabited by people who just are cut off spiritually from any group, and self-aware to an unprecedented degree, such an assumption is a prison, a thought prison. It is, in effect, a demand that we ourselves must and ought to inhabit a societal prison, and all our hopes then become fixed upon that prison becoming as kind and efficient as possible, perhaps, the common therapeutic value stance, functioning more like a hospital than a prison. But, we believe, because of our assumptions, it is a thought prison society that inevitably must and shall remain. How does this relate to so-called A? I think it helps understand the otherwise extraordinary degree of optimism, and indeed existential hope, that so many people place in these new technologies which operate by rapidly and simply pooling and processing vast quantities of anonymous data, under the ruling, but implicit, assumption that this group process is superior to any individual. AI, in other words, is a variant of the wisdom of crowds assumption. A equals wisdom of crowds on steroids. A seems to such people, with such wisdom of crowds assumptions, to offer a permanent way out from the inevitable evil and partiality of individuals, a way forward towards a world of universally accessible knowledge, ability, and objective virtue. My point here is that, to my judgment anyway, the actual nature of what happens with AI systems is, by its nature, obviously not knowledgeable, not competent, and cannot be wise. And the same applies to the various systems of democracy, the processes of bureaucracy, the work of voting committees. Once you become aware of, and explicitly consider, what actually happens inside these black boxes, then it is obvious that they cannot be good. For exactly analogous reasons, AI cannot be good. But people have the metaphysical assumptions that they have, and these are often buried deep, and are typically regarded as facts. Most people evidently do not want to become aware of their fundamental convictions, nor to acknowledge that they are indeed assumptions, therefore not the consequence of evidence and logic. Yet it is these assumptions concerning what is effective, true and good, that lead to the absurd conviction and hope that AI is, whether actually already, or potentially, wise, competent, and will be beneficial overall and in the long term. Until these ridiculous, but pervasive, wisdom of crowds assumptions are exposed and acknowledged, then many or most people will remain spiritually helpless and resistant to help, emotionally and intellectually enthralled to those who designed, created, implemented, and administer the AI systems. Another version of this, although rare nowadays, especially in practice, is faith in the truth and rightness of tradition, belief in the wisdom of the crowds of the past, perhaps. But due to modern self-awareness, it has become impossible to establish unambiguously what is tradition. Tradition itself becomes contested, and then the problem reverts to the modern one of who or what entity has the authority to declare what is the real and true tradition. That tradition is a variant of the wisdom of crowds delusion, is evident in the way that so many self-identified traditionalists have embraced and become advocates of AI. They apparently believe, or hope, that AI, properly designed and used, will become a generally accessible, and easily usable, supreme source and repository of the wisdom of the crowds of the past. It was, I think, the fact that I had exposed and made explicit my own atheist, modernizing, groupist, progressivist etc. assumptions, that ultimately led to my recognizing their arbitrary incoherence and inadequacy, then abandoning them, and consciously choosing and adopting something better. How do future expectations, doctor, husband and father, resurrected man, affect present behavior? Bruce Charlton. Possible future expectations need to be confident in order to be effective in shaping present life. At least, confident to the degree that we can be sure of anything in this mortal life of change and uncertainty. When I was a medical student, I was confident of becoming a doctor, therefore that expectation shaped my present behavior so that I did far more than the minimum necessary to pass qualifying exams. I looked ahead to being a doctor, and wanted to equip myself for that situation, so I did extra classes, sought out extra teaching, made more effort to prepare myself. In other words, as a medical student I was willing, able, indeed keen to forego present gratifications, to the extent of which I was capable, when this seemed likely to contribute to my future state as a doctor. In contrast, as an adolescent and young adult I did not expect to become a husband and father, and did nothing strenuous to prepare for that eventuality, made no serious or significant sacrifices of pleasure, or creation, or career to that end. The vague possibility that I might become a husband, a father, was insufficiently motivating to shape my life. If I had been confident that was what I wanted and would likely happen, things would, presumably, have been different. What about the possible future state of salvation, the possibility of resurrection to eternal heavenly life? The lesson of the doctor and husband examples is that we need to want and be confident of a future state, in order that it shall shape our present life. Therefore, if it is desired that Christians' present behavior be shaped by resurrection, then our understanding of salvation will need to be one that could instill confidence that we could get it if we want it. This understanding of salvation as something anyone can have if he wants it and will follow Jesus, is set out in the fourth Gospel. Assuming this book can be read and understood as an autonomous text. By contrast, the traditional mainstream church understandings of salvation that render it not just uncertain, but unlikely. For example, because these churches regard salvation as requiring a wide range of particular and mandatory behaviors, knowledge and judgment of which is administered by a particular church. And because damnation is regarded as the natural default state, render our hope of salvation something about which it is impossible, and indeed counterproductive, to be confident. Which understanding thereby renders our expectation of salvation so feebly motivating as to be incapable of shaping our present life. Civil war and/or world war may not be socio-politically stoppable, but must spiritually be understood, before taking sides. Bruce Charlton. Lots of, very belated, media chat at present about the strategically engineered conditions for within nations civil war/genocide in Western countries, alongside the ongoing Western escalation towards all-out international world war. It is very late in the day to be noticing this, and it is probably many, many years too late for these possibilities to be prevented by normal, public socio-political action. Indeed, it seems to me that the only reasons such wars or genocides haven't already happened, is that the totalitarian establishment cannot decide what it most wants to inflict on the masses, in the choice between global and civil wars, since it is probably not viable for both to happen simultaneously. But people need to recognize that this much too late awakening to the dangers or inevitability of civil war, is itself the product of a top-down establishment initiative, the subject is belatedly being discussed, and socio-political resistance encouraged, only and exactly because it is by now too late for social political action to have any prospect of doing good. People are being encouraged, implicitly and explicitly, to take sides, when the sides they are supposed to choose between have been created and sustained by totalitarian action, and for evil purposes. In fact, the masses, having been divided and set against each other, are being led into a mutually destructive trap. The real challenge is to understand what is going on in the spiritual war of this world. Understand who are the sources of purposive evil that have engineered the present situation, and what is their underlying agenda. And any positive and good societal outcomes can only come after each person has chosen sides in the spiritual war, choosing not between the sides offered by officialdom, corporations and the mass media, but instead choosing between the side that is God, divine creation, and personal salvation, or else choosing one of the many sides that are ranged against these. Discussing free will, a problem with arguing about Christianity, is that most people most of the time don't understand what they are arguing for. Bruce Charlton. I'm a bit obsessed with this business of understanding as a prerequisite. As a spontaneous philosopher, I am naturally an argumentative person, who has striven for the past couple of decades to suppress this trait because it was, mostly, a pointless waste of my life. More exactly, it was pointless in terms of trying to change other people and the world, which is what I was trying to do. Actually, the arguing was sometimes useful to me, in clarifying my own understanding, especially when I became aware that I did not really understand what I was arguing for. This was also something that sometimes happened when I was teaching. I'd be standing writing something on the board and expounding it, when I realized that it didn't make sense or I was just putting out a black box assertion. These were significant moments of learning. It has happened on this blog too. Early on in its history, I was trying to explain to William James Tykonevich what was free will and how it worked, because he did not seem to be able to grasp what I was saying and kept on questioning me. when I realized I myself did not understand what I was saying about free will. Ultimately, I was parroting forms of words that I had heard or read elsewhere, and they really didn't make sense. I was repeating the classical theological arguments about free will that I had come across in Boethius, C.S. Lewis, and scholarly accounts of Aquinas, and I recognized that I could not understand them, not really. Further thought led to a recognition that my personal inability to understand was not, in this case, from inadequate intelligence or insufficient thought, but that the arguments were intrinsically ununderstandable because they contained abstractions that served the role of a black box, a logical package the role of whose content was asserted but could never be grasped. The classic theological argument I was defending was that God was assumed to be omniscient, omnipotent, and omni-God and created everything from nothing including me, and that free will was then gifted to me by God. The particular incomprehensible abstraction was that God could and did give free will, which is the agency of an individual to act from himself, and independently of God. This is incomprehensible because if literally everything, including everything about me and my environment, is made by God, then it makes no sense that God could give something that was independent of and autonomous from God. In other words, the assumptions excluded the answer. The assumption was that absolutely everything came from God, was contradicted by the assertion that God could make something independent of God, and then give it to me. How is it that such a stark contradiction became Christian dogma? How is it that so many very intelligent and thoughtful people have ignored, or not seen, it? One answer is that such people were not really interested either in understanding or in explaining free will, but were instead absolutely committed to the assumption that the Christian God was an omni-God. So the fact that they personally did not really grasp what is free will or how free will worked, did not really matter to them. Another reason that the contradiction is ignored, is that the contradiction was renamed a mystery, and thereby safeguarded from critique. What they were, evidently, most focused on was winning any possible argument directed against the idea of the Christian God being an omni-God, and the statement that an omni-God could and did create autonomous beings by an act of gift did not really need to be understood. How such a gift actually made sense was of secondary importance to them. Also, having made this assertion of gifting free will, the incomprehension was sustained by the fact that their definition, their understanding, of free will was negative. Free will was being defined in terms of independence from God. Significantly, the scientific assertions about free will have a closely analogous negativity, being defined in terms of something that is not caused. Something I have learned is that when something is negatively defined, it becomes ungraspable in itself, of itself. So, the mainstream orthodox statements about free will have the effect of making it mysterious at best and ineradicably incomprehensible at worst. As anyone knows who has tried to discuss free will in the public forum, argument devolves to assertions that something was done by free will, versus assertions that it was instead the inevitable outcome of preceding causes, whether scientific causes or caused by God. Free will is a particularly stark example of the problems of uncomprehended abstraction, and definition by negation. It results in making mysterious, and indeed unreal, something that is one of the primary spontaneous experiences of every human being. Something, moreover, that is essential to being a Christian, at least by my fourth gospel-rooted understanding. If people cannot freely decide to follow Jesus Christ or not, then this excludes values from Christianity. Arguments against those whose assumptions make free will incomprehensible, whether Orthodox traditional Christians, or mainstream secular people, is futile, since these people do not really themselves understand what they are asserting, and do not see any need why they should understand it. To repeat, such people often have a fixed and committed belief that personally genuinely understanding what they affirm is not necessary. As indeed, it would not be necessary if free will had indeed the negative, abstract, subordinate role they assert for it. The general lesson I draw from this is related to the importance of really understanding for oneself, and of not being satisfied by black box abstractions, or parroting stuff taken from other people. This is true, no matter how prestigious is the source of the black box argument. And further, if we are to avoid intractable error, our personal understanding needs to be in positive terms. It might be objected that this cannot possibly happen in practice, given the sheer number of things that must be taken on trust in any complex civilization. This is true in a quantitative sense, about most matters of assertion, but is false when it comes to those matters which are of core significance to ourselves. And there we come to the crux, for a Christian at any rate. What really is most important for us to understand, what, indeed, is it vital for us personally to grasp? In the past, Christians regarded belief in the omni-God as vital and necessary, but understanding free will was merely optional, to the point that it was not understood, and indeed not understandable within the assumptions. Yet, here and now, for myself and probably for most people, it is vital to understand, that is really to grasp in positive terms, free will, agency, the basis of individuality. To say it is real but a mystery is an evasion, when something looms so large at the heart of our existence. The needful understanding is something made impossible both to those who accept mainstream, orthodox Christian theology, and indeed theologies of most other religions, as well as the much larger numbers of people who regard science as the basic assumption behind all explanations. As so often, the individual cannot look to any of the most powerful, influential, prestigious, ancient or modern external sources for an understanding of something that he may regard as a matter of prime importance. As so often, the individual must either do it for himself, i.e. discover by his own efforts a genuine understanding of the reality of free will, or else must take the consequences of assimilating, living by, and thinking in accordance with, the socio-cultural insignificance of his own agency. Note added, it is pretty obvious why it has suited, and still suits, the powers that be, to create and maintain a situation in which free will is kept mysterious, contradictory, ununderstandable, while top-down and collective imperatives are by contrast clear, simple, easily comprehensible. This endemic doubt and uncertainty keeps people obedient to external authority. When people cannot satisfactorily conceptualize themselves, then they are controllable at the deepest spiritual level. The biggest Christianity problem of our times. Bruce Charlton. A few observations. Lack of Christianity is killing people, and the world. In that sense, any kind of Christianity, of desiring salvation by Jesus Christ, is better than nothing. I believe that the decision concerning salvation comes after death of the body. Which is just as well, because it means that the very large majority who are not Christian and have little prospect of becoming so, still have the chance to choose. Nonetheless, it is still ourselves that makes the choice after death, the eternal spiritual self that we carry over through death. This means that any of the majority, it seems, who were born with good souls, souls capable of love and valuing love, and who are genuinely ignorant or innocent in mortal life, will have a good chance of choosing rightly after death. When they have discovered that the offer of resurrected, eternal heavenly life is real and possible, their loving nature and desires will make them want what Jesus offers. Yet, even among those born with good souls, how few adolescents and adults, especially in the West, are genuinely ignorant or innocent. And it is exactly their desires that are disordered, that are too often, at least, so far as one can judge, actively turned against salvation. And even among self-identified Christians, there seem extremely few who seem to have salvation as their positive priority. And it seems that the churches are so confused or corrupted in their priorities that they seldom seem to help and very often strongly hinder clarity on this crucial point. Because negative desires, such as fear of death or misery or hell, do not suffice, and indeed, given the many alternative possibilities to salvation, hardly assist at all in making the right choice. This is perhaps the biggest Christianity problem of our times. Is the primary authority of the fourth gospel just a matter of my personal preference? Bruce Charlton. According the fourth gospel primary authority is indeed a matter of my personal preference, since even before I was a Christian it always seemed that it was the most beautiful book of the Bible. But is it just that, merely personal? No, there is something more to it than taste, and something that may be generally true. For many years I interpreted the fourth gospel in the mainstream Orthodox way, as a kind of mystical appendix to the synoptics and Paul's letters, or else part of a mosaic of biblical evidence but without special eminence. This framework meant that the meanings of the fourth gospel could not, and did not change anything substantive, it merely provided a kind of radiant glow around the main stuff, which was elsewhere. It was only after I had decided to read and reread the fourth gospel as the primary authority, on the basis of what the book said about itself confirmed by my deepest intuitions, and that it really did feel deeply like a near contemporary eyewitness account by an intimate of Jesus. Only after doing this multiple reread, did I realize, and with considerable shock, that instead of being mystical, abstract and vague, the fourth gospel was actually highly coherent and clear. But about what? There I was shocked to find that what it was so clear about was that the essence of Jesus' teaching was that of resurrected eternal life, possible for all those who recognized and followed Jesus. This was shocking because it was so plain, and because I had a kind of inner snobbery against a religion which was based upon promising its adherents eternal and fulfilling life after death. This offer of better times to come later seemed like a simple-minded basis for a religion, designed to appeal mainly to selfish and simple-minded people. Almost like the nasty caricature of Christianity by its enemies, a controlling socio-political scheme offering pie in the sky for those who do what we say, and think what we tell them to think. A classic bit of priestly manipulation. Except that in the actual fourth gospel, when read as a coherent whole, the offer of resurrected life was not conditional upon obedience to an external authority or adherence to complex laws and rules. Indeed, there wasn't anything in the valid parts of the gospel about setting up a priesthood or church. The gospel is about an unsocio-political, as non-institutional, as could be imagined. It is all about loving familial and marriage relationships. Fourth gospel was about our attitude to and relationship with Jesus primarily, and his Father secondarily yet necessarily. So that when I then went back to reread the other books of the New Testament in light of the fourth gospel, I often seemed to be reading about another Jesus, a Jesus whose focus was very different from fourth gospel, and who was, as his priority, proposing primarily to set up a new priesthood and a new church, with all that entailed in terms of laws and practices. Therefore, to read the fourth gospel as the primary authority of Jesus Christ that the gospel itself tells us that it is, seems to entail a very profound reshaping of what has become the mainstream orthodox understanding of what Christianity is, its nature, aims, mechanisms. If the fourth gospel is accepted and embraced as true and valid in its own right, then the rest of the Bible needs to be approached with a great deal of selectivity, and a good deal of it needs to be discarded. Small wonder, it seems to me, that the fourth gospel has, and apparently since very early after the ascension of Jesus, been accorded only a minor, subordinate, supplementary role in defining the teaching of Jesus, and the true nature of substantive Christianity. The process of reading and rereading spontaneously led to the rejection of a few parts of the gospel being recognized as, to me, obviously alien and from another source, with a contradictory implication from the unity of the whole. For instance, chapter 21 comes after the gospel, pretty clearly, has ended with a recapitulation. More exactly, Christianity/following Jesus is presented an inner desire and attitude that can, when necessary, be practiced in the context of any religion, or none. Christian theologians misunderstanding the ancient philosophers. Ultimately, fundamentally, purpose really means desires of living beings. Bruce Charlton. I talk a good deal on this blog about purpose, and how important it is, yet purpose is an abstraction, hence not really real, but just a symbol for reality. The reality is the personal desires of living beings. For most theologically minded people, the abstract nature of purpose is important, because theologians want purpose to be detachable from individual persons, such that it can be implanted or put into a being, for example by God. The currently dominant half-baked philosophies of AI are also dependent on this abstraction, since they assert that purpose is something that can be built into computer, robots and the like, inserted by external entities such as computer programmers and engineers, and their paymasters. But, if I am rigorous, and manage to escape the bad habits of my socialized, 21st century metaphysics, then I acknowledge that purpose is ultimately the desires, the wantings of beings. In a nutshell, purpose is an attribute of particular, living, conscious, eternal, spiritual, beings. A major difficulty of classical traditional theologians in the 21st century, and indeed for several centuries already, albeit increasing, is that inherited Christian theology implicitly incorporates the ancient Greek, Platonic, Aristotelian, and also scholastic Aquinas-derived, sense of purpose as an attribute of a being. For example, when Aristotle, apparently, explains the motion of things, such as gravity, in terms of where entities want to be, or when Aquinas describes the stars and planets as being angels. The ancients knew, from their personal daily experience, but unconsciously and implicitly, that they inhabited a living universe. This formed an unspoken background structure, a matrix, for all their philosophizing. Those in the past were developing their abstract logical arguments on the unconscious, implicit, yet vital, assumption of a living universe of beings with desires. But modern theologians who expound, as they suppose, ancient or medieval theology and philosophy have, almost invariably, lost this implicit assumption, at least since their adolescence, and have not restored it by conscious choice. The consequence is that the bottom-line assumption of modern classical theologians is of the divinely entailed validity of an abstracted version of Greek medieval logic, operating in an originally dead universe. And this originally dead universe mindset has been inherited by nearly all post-Reformation theology, and the atheist traditions of philosophy including science, and also and more obviously the rationality that underpins and regulates the modern system of governance, corporations, media etc. In sum, modern, post-medieval, theology is rooted in pure abstraction, which is why it is experienced as dry, quibbling, irrelevant to me here now, why it does not convince. In order to follow the reasoning of such philosophers, we are compelled to think from a stance in which abstract logic is the primary reality, operating in an otherwise lifeless reality. So that human beings, you and me, are being regarded very much as if we were, bottom line, ultimately, nothing but the product of logic. We are excluded from the assumptions, and, consequently, the conclusions. Into this assumed dead universe, God then puts souls that he has made from nothing. God puts into these inserted souls other attributes, such as purpose, and freedom. And this kind of abstract stuff is what we are invited to imagine, invited to believe. Nay, instructed that we must believe, about ourselves, everybody else, the world and universe. To put it starkly, classic traditional theology of the 21st century pictures a kind of zombie universe, dead but animated by some kind of insertion of properties. However, this isn't what people believed 2,000 or even 1,000 years ago, because it leaves out their spontaneous animism, their implicit and unconscious knowing that ultimately reality consisted of living beings, and the properties and attributes of these beings emerged from this living nature. No matter what the ancients wrote, this animism lay behind it, which was why the abstract logical scholastic philosophy was not, to them, then, dry and quibbling and irrelevant in the way it is to us, now. The history of human consciousness, and therefore of philosophy and theology, is one of emergence from spontaneous innate animism, to the present state when animism is no longer spontaneous, but is denied and ridiculed. Consequently, our ultimate metaphysical philosophy is either/both incoherent and/or consists of irrelevant autonomous syllogisms. But we need consciously and by choice, to recover the implicit and, mostly, unconscious animism of the past, if we are really to understand by experience the nature of reality. Therefore we must beware of the delusions of abstractions understood in a way that did not apply to Aristotle and Aquinas, whose minds included the built-in assumption of living beings as a given. And this built-in assumption underlay everything they thought and wrote. Note, the above insight is heavily indebted to the work of Owen Barfield, e.g. Saving the Appearances, and Rudolf Scheiner, e.g. The Riddles of Philosophy. Rather than being a part of the fake alternative economy and promoting it self-interestedly, it's spiritually better to have a job explicitly in service to evil totalitarianism, and repent the fact. Bruce Charlton. Rather than being a part of the fake alternative economy, and defending it on the untrue basis that it is genuinely alternative, it is spiritually better to have a job explicitly in service to evil totalitarianism, and to know that is what you are doing. And to repent the necessity. The idea that there is any qualitatively distinct alternative economy, independent from and opposed to the mainstream system of socio-political discourse and exchange, is itself part of that totalitarian system. That there is an alternative is delusional, because all institutions of any significant size, wealth, power, influence are necessarily bound to the mainstream by multiple legal, financial and regulatory ties, or else the institution could not arise and be sustained. This also applies to churches. Nobody can run any kind of operation that pays taxes, employs people, has property, etc., and also be autonomous. And if you are part of the system, you serve the system. Since nobody can qualitatively escape working for the system, since everything that pays us a living wage is compelled to serve Caesar, the essential is to know and repent that plain fact. Jesus apparently didn't try to stop people working as publicans or tax collectors, or even priests. For example, Nicodemus, but he did insist that they acknowledge that they are thereby, as well as for innumerable other reasons, sinners. This repentance at the inevitability and inescapability of being a sinner in this mortal life and world, is part of what being a Christian requires of us. And why people whom society regarded as especially bad by the nature of their jobs, were so often the earliest followers of Jesus. So given that we are all in the same boat in a qualitative sense, and that quantitative differences make no significant difference to salvation, why am I saying that it is sometimes / often worse to regard oneself as part of the alternative sector? The reason is simply that such people suppose themselves to be qualitatively and significantly more virtuous than those who are part of the mainstream, by virtue of the source of their income. And therefore, instead of acknowledging and repenting their servitude to evil totalitarianism, they continually celebrate their own moral superiority to others. Indeed, such people, almost invariably, are engaged in active promotion of their bit of the pseudo-alternative, and therefore promotion of the system. They want our attention, time, support, and money, for themselves and their enterprise. And this is dishonestly justified by the false pretense that this selfishly beneficial redirection will subvert and, maybe, eventually, replace totalitarianism. But the beginning of wisdom is to know that in our this worldly lives we all serve Caesar, and that, as of 2025, Caesar serves Satan. Anti-war pacifists. Then, Bruce Charlton. I have a low opinion of self-proclaimed anti-war pacifists, especially those who make a big thing of it, the peace studies type. Although I understand it, and from the inside, because I was that way myself as a young man, for obvious reasons. But what really gets me, is how fragile and evanescent is pacifism, no matter how established and entrenched by years of reading the relevant books and magazines, watching the relevant TV plays and movies. In 2022 nearly all these anti-war pacifist upper-middle-class intellectuals, bureaucrats, managers, became fanatically pro-war activists overnight. And continuing. Why this 180 degrees, instant and effortless, change of convictions? Apparently, very simply, because they were told to become fanatically pro-war by their favorite politicians, newspapers and especially the BBC. That, in a nutshell, illustrates the depth and strength and moral seriousness of decades-long ideological anti-war pacifist convictions, in practice. Media negativism, the next step in disbelief. Bruce Charlton. Lots of people nowadays affect media negativism, and state that they always disbelieve the mass media. However, in reality their skepticism is merely skin deep. What happens is that, whenever the media publishes something with which they disagree or that contradicts their worldview, then they reflexively doubt it. But, and aren't we all prone to this one? When something gets into the mass media that confirms our prejudices, suddenly we find ourselves bringing it to the attentions of others with some variant of a triumphant. There. See? I told you so. Supposedly alternative or counter-establishment bloggers are among the very worst offenders in this regard. Indeed, most of the most productive, popular and influential right-wing blogs would have nothing to say if they failed to comment on mass media reportage in just this manner. Yet, of course, if the mass media are utterly dishonest and slavishly serve the totalitarian agenda, which they are and do, then we ought especially to disbelieve and ignore them when they seem to be reinforcing our preconceptions. Because we can then be confident that we ourselves are there and then being manipulated. Dealing with fear by personal thoughts of faith and love, not via groupism, nor with optimism, pride, or safety-seeking. Bruce Charlton. People always want to know what to do, and this need is used to manipulate us. Because all the standard available notions of doing good and improving the world are long since captured and put to work for strategic evil. But, of course, we really do need to know what to do. There's always a lot of the sin of fear about. It is infectious and people also have a tendency to seek it, a misplaced sense of duty to face the reality of the worst, in practice, the worst as interpreted and presented by the mass media, and overcome it. Chronic, existential fear isn't something that can be avoided or eradicated, at least, not for those capable of the experience. Yet we do genuinely need to overcome, we need to deal with fear, so we need to consider how to deal with it. Typical wrong ways of dealing with fear include optimism, adopting a belief that the feared thing cannot or will not happen, or pride, that if it does happen, I personally, and my gang, can overcome it. Another wrong way is to seek safety from the feared, to flee it, or defend against it. These are bad ways of dealing with fear, because they are negative, they try to use one sin to fight another. Thus, optimism is dishonest, pride is this worldly, safety is impossible in this mortal earthly life. Others fight fear by trying to build protective alliances, groups, with the implication that fear is something we collectively intend to defeat, sometime in the future, so long as we can persuade or coerce other people to join in the fight. But fear needs to be fought immediately, not in the future, and this means fought by each person as he now is, and individually. We must take personal responsibility to do what is needed, without delaying for conditions to improve. The first faith required is that God would not leave us without the necessary resources. So anybody and everywhere can do what is needed, it's a matter of knowing what. Also, the answer will be, must be, for individuals and not dependent on social factors, will be immediate, can be consciously adopted, and is a matter of free action. The answer is therefore going to be neither hard nor abstract, and shall be within anyone's grasp who chooses it. Since we know that the answer must be possible to happen individually, immediately, and therefore directly. It's pretty well known among Christians that we should fight fear with love and faith, a loving kind of faith, faith in the ultimate power of love. But people get hung up on exactly what such action means in practice, here and now. For instance, faith is usually weak, and often weak because external in source, self-contradicting, and neither grasped nor inwardly endorsed. Faith will not overcome fear unless is real and strong to us personally, which means experientially. And of course Christian faith needs to be in God the Creator, known as personal, parental, and good, not, therefore, faith another kind of God with other characteristics. Love is the basis of divine creation, and love cannot be dictated, therefore to be effective for good, love must be genuine. We can only make a positive difference for that which we really love. And as for action, the false assumption of our materialist civilization is that action must be physical to be effective, whereas if action is to be individual and immediate, then such action needs to be known as spiritual, not physical, and thinking recognized as, potentially, an action that affects divine creation. So it is possible for any person to do positive good for whatever and whoever he really loves, and almost instantly, by thinking upon the subject on the above lines. But the needful will probably only click, and happen, pretty briefly. Because the conditions necessary are rather delicate. And what it is that happens is known primarily by direct apprehension, rather than indirectly via images, words, concepts and the like. Description and communication come after the needful has happened, and will be approximate at best, that should be expected, and not regarded as a weakness or refutation of what has happened. All of which also needs a kind of faith in the way that things work in divine creation, by love and spiritually, also, faith that God will take notice and incorporate what brief yet significant good we may accomplish in such ways. The Dissolution of Form. William Wildblood. In the end times a major principle is dissolution, meaning all form built up sometimes over many centuries crumbles. Organizations created to sustain a culture and civilization are taken over and rotted from within. They are infiltrated by forces actually opposed to the ideals behind them and, to use an expressive modern term, worn as a skinsuit, subverting their original intention. Churches are a major example of this, but the phenomenon is widespread. This tendency to dissolution works out in many ways, and one of them is the self-destructive tendency of modern Western nations. I said in a comment on a recent Bruce Charlton post that in the past all nations or groups sought to preserve themselves, but Western nations now are encouraged to destroy themselves, and led to believe that doing this is a virtuous act. The inspiration behind this can only come from the forces of chaotic evil, as defined in Bruce Charlton's post, and it demonstrates how these forces are supplanting necessary evil which, though evil, does not completely deny real good. Non-Western nations and peoples might enjoy watching this, thinking the wheel of fortune is about to turn in their favor, but in fact once the West crumbles they will be left wide open to chaotic evil themselves. It is interesting to note that when I lived in India 40 years ago, many people there were of the opinion that British colonialism had been a net benefit to the country, But now the almost universal belief seems to be, especially among the younger generation, that the colonial powers were just rapacious predators. Such people are usually ignorant of real history and motivated by a mixture of resentment and misplaced national pride, not to mention the after effects of over 50 years of Marxist propaganda. The reality is that even if Western colonialism started off as a desire to seize the spoils of undeveloped nations, it became from the 19th century onwards the means whereby the non-Western nations could move forward out of their spiritual stagnation into the era of the consciousness soul as defined by Rudolf Steiner. This represents the fullest development of self-awareness and individualization, and is a necessary precursor to a more positive spiritual awareness. It marks the separation of the ego from its environment, and has led to many of the ills of the modern world, but without passing through this stage the soul cannot become consciously aligned with divine reality and a full creator in its own right. It is somewhat akin to leaving the Garden of Eden, and the meaning behind the old saying that it requires separation to lead to completion. That is the justification for the colonial enterprise, which had a spiritual purpose, much as those in the colonized countries may not wish to acknowledge the fact now. Ironically, their resentment at their colonizing shows they have absorbed its lessons and become more individually aware. The next phase for them is to show maturity and acknowledge the benefits they have received. This is not so much in the form of Western medicine, science, technology, political systems etc. as a new form of consciousness, one which marks a break with being largely embedded in nature and provides a launching pad to a higher spiritual awareness. Clearly, I am not saying there was no one in the colonized countries who had not already made this break in their own way, but neither the masses nor the culture as a whole had until influenced by the West. I've got somewhat off track here, but only to point out that what first manifests in the West will then spread everywhere. That is the nature of these end times. We are witnessing the breakdown of form as happens in old age, and, as in old age, we can either cling to the old mode of life for as long as possible or fix our mind on higher things. The destroyers of form may be doing the work of the end times, but they are still in themselves part of chaotic evil. Those who seek to preserve ancient form, and not just as outward structure but in order to preserve the spiritual content it once had, are doing noble work because it is good to avoid collapse for as long as possible. However, they are probably doomed to failure because of the nature of these end times, though this is not a doctrine of pessimism any more than to acknowledge that summer turns to winter. Instead, it should lead us to move our attention away from this world into the underlying reality behind it. Then at some time in the future new forms will arise, forms better able to express that reality, but first we must endure the dismantling of the old whose time seems to have come. In these days many people are turning to tradition to rescue them from the desecrations of modernity, and it is good, even vital, to seek the wisdom of the past at such a time. However, the traditional forms do not have the power they once did and cannot be revived, certainly not to their former glory. We should all learn from tradition, but we cannot restore its ancient structures, which are without exception subject to the energy of end times dissolution. Sometimes it is hard to separate form and spirit, but that is the lesson of the present time. What is it to be spiritually uncompromising? With reference to the Christian Litmus Test Fail of so-called A. Bruce Charlton. A couple of years after becoming a Christian, I encountered the work of Father Seraphim Rose. I warmed to him immediately, as he was a modern Westerner who had become an uncompromising and spiritually dedicated Eastern Orthodox monk, while at the same time embodying a warm-hearted, loving nature. One of my greatest disappointments on becoming a Christian was the insipid worldly compromise of all the Christians I knew of. They were, where it most mattered, spiritually indistinguishable from the mainstream of atheistic materialists. Seraphim Rose, with his ascetic and hermit-like life, was, it seemed to me, on a different and qualitatively higher level of holiness, that very unusually enabled him to discern clearly, and give full value to the depth, as well as breadth, of the modern spiritual malaise. By contrast, other Christians I came across really did not seem to grasp the profundity and seriousness of our civilization's spiritual malaise. However, I fairly soon recognized that the monastic life, which attempts to live materially in a way that is compatible with spiritual understanding, is not an answer. Seraphim Rose was almost unique among monks in his warm-hearted asceticism, because other monks are either warm-hearted but worldly, deluded, often corrupt, or else they may be genuinely ascetic but with a narrow, harsh and prideful rigidity. A group that Seraphim Rose called the super-correct. In other words, I now distinguish between the inner spiritual self on the one hand, and the public and social self. Indeed, I think that the inevitably failing attempt of people to live their lives fully in accordance with the highest Christian hopes is actually a major source of spiritual corruption among Christians. What actually happens is that Christians cut their Christianity to fit the cloth of their nature and circumstances. In other words, the limitations of their personality and abilities, and the pressure of their lives, are allowed to dictate the scope and aspirations of their Christian faith. They limit their definitions of Christianity to whatever they can themselves accomplish. Examples include the spiritual litmus tests of our time. The practicalities of living in an evil totalitarian system mean that most people will inevitably, more or less, go along with the demonically originated evil strategies that are designed to engineer our society into a machine of damnation. A current example, a spiritual test that most Christians have failed spectacularly, is so-called A. The way it seems to work is that a Christian finds himself in a work or life situation in which he is compelled to use, and even to work with and develop and propagandize for, AI systems. Compelled in that either he follows these bureaucratic diktats, or else he fails to get the job, is sacked from his current job, or cannot get promoted above a low level. Or else the Christian cannot resist the temptations of using AI to amuse or divert himself. Or he may find that he cannot resist using AI to add a professional, pseudo-creative, gloss to his own productions, or to project an image of greater knowledge, competence, understanding than he personally possesses, maybe at work, or in his hobbies. Then, because Christian finds himself in his actions and life either compelled to use, or expediently using, A.I.', he argues that therefore AI is not, in its actual origins and implementation, intentionally evil, but is merely a neutral tool, or a must-do qualitative breakthrough in societal capability, with potential significant benefits for humanity that we therefore have a duty to exploit. Because Christian actually uses AI and has no intention of stopping, he infers that, because he is a Christian, therefore AI must be a good thing, and he soon finds himself defending and proselytizing for AI in both public, but also even in private. I have come to believe that if Christians try to insist upon a compatibility of Christian actions with spiritual aspirations, what this actually leads to is a dishonest denial of real and significant evil among Christians, and the airbrushing of their own sins as trivial or non-existent. Rigorous and devout Christians are therefore, in practice, nearly always, those who make a big deal about their own avoidance of some categories of big sins, like murder, theft, rape, sexual infidelity and unchastity, drug use, while denying, engaging in and defending many other sins, but especially those expedient and publicly acceptable besetting sins of mainstream modern life. Sins such as systematic untruthfulness, e.g. the frequent and extreme levels of habitual and pervasive dishonesty that are now a condition of all middle-class employment, including in all churches. Or fear and resentment. And defending or promoting the cause of global A. The orthodox and traditional idea is that all men ought to cease from all sinning, so the answer to such examples of sinning as lying for money and status, and covering up the demonic totalitarian plans for corrupting mankind with A.I.', is that people ought to stop doing this, as people should stop doing everything bad. My view is different, because I accept as a fact that people cannot, as well as will not, stop sinning. People who must deceive in order to keep their jobs and get promotions, will continue to deceive. People who are managerially instructed to implement and promote AI will continue to do this, and those who personally get pleasure or profit from using AI systems will continue to exploit them for such purposes. In general terms, people will continue to sin, and will continue to have no serious intention of ceasing from sin. However, this is not a reason to pretend that sins are not sins, that evil strategies are not real, that people personally aren't working to overall promote the plans of the demonic world rulers. But following what I take to be a core teaching of Jesus, I expect that all men are and will be sinners and will not, cannot stop doing this, and shall not even have any serious or workable plans to stop sinning, and this applies even the most devout and ascetic and good of modern monks like Seraphim Rose, even in the most ideally unworldly of environments. I see no reason why this our pervasively sinful and evil promoting lives are incompatible with being a genuinely devout and uncompromising Christian in our spiritual aspirations. In sum, we must not compromise our Christian principles in all their depth and rigor merely because we cannot and never will live up to them. Indeed, only by separating our spiritual understanding and aims from the corruptions of everyday life, can we really discern, understand, appreciate the nature of this world, and the profundity of our own corruption, and do this without being overwhelmed by despair, which is itself a potentially terrible sin. We can always be at work at clarifying our spiritual nature in the most uncompromising way, indifferent to the constraints and practicalities that are inescapable. This is what Jesus also says, by my understanding, at least in the fourth gospel. Jesus does not select his followers for their good behavior, nor does he say that his followers should cease from all sinning, but instead Jesus implies and says he came to save actual sinners. Stopping sinning, either in particular or in general, is not the way that men attain eternal resurrected heavenly life.